you everyone. My name is Aaron Peckham, and today I am presenting the Historical Socrates, an analysis of the contemporary sources. Now, for my research in this discussion, I'm choosing to focus on the contemporary sources, though there are many later historians and philosophers who wrote about Socrates. There were only three that knew him, that were able to write about him from knowing him in his own lifetime. And so there are, but as documented by later historians, there are a few facts that we do know about Socrates. We know he did die in 399 after being executed at trial, at the age of 71, which puts his birth at estimated 470 BC. In his trial in 399 BC, he was accused of a few things, such as making weaker arguments into stronger arguments, and corrupting the youth of Athens, as well as defaming the traditional gods of Athens. And for all of this, he was executed by poison. He was made to drink the hemlock, which is traditionally believed, which is a poisonous flower. As regard to his character, we have a few problems pinpointing who he actually was. This is known as the Socratic problem. The reason for this stems from a few facts. One, that he never wrote anything at all about himself, about his philosophy, anything really. And there were only 3 people that knew him in his lifetime that wrote about him, whose works we still have surviving today. There may be more, but these are the only 3 that we still have. They are Aristophanes, Xenophon, and of course Plato. The first of these is Aristophanes, who is an Athenian comedic playwright, and he is the early surviving source of Socrates, who he features in his play The Clouds, which is a play about Socrates. In this play, Socrates owns this school for philosophers, and this other character whose name I cannot pronounce shows up to talk to Socrates, and throughout the course of this, Socrates tries to convince him that the traditional Greek gods are not real, and that the real gods are in fact the clouds that he worships from the top of his philosopher's school. Now, this play was written for a competition at Great Dionysia, in which it won the 3rd prize, and the 2nd place, Conus by Amipsius, also featured Socrates. However, unfortunately, neither that one or the 1st place or any of the other plays from that competition survived. And so The Clouds is the only of these plays that we still have. Now, one of the most notable things about this is that Socrates was, of course, notable enough of a public figure to be used in a comedic play. Traditional Greek plays traditionally featured very well-known public figures who would be satirically portrayed as caricatures of how the public saw them. This is very similar to what we see today in shows like Saturday Night Live, where we see very over-the-top portrayals of politicians like Donald Trump, Barack Obama, who the caricatures of them are considered funny because we know them from how public they are, and therefore the context of jokes made about them are well known because of how public their figure is. And the same is true of Socrates, as is apparent by his appearance in not only The Clouds but also Conus. And in this play, of course, Socrates takes money for teaching and teaches this young man to make stronger arguments out of weaker arguments, which are traits typically associated with the sophists of Athens. And so Aristophanes was presenting Socrates as a caricature of the sophists, and many of the things that he portrays Socrates doing in this play kind of foreshadow some of the later accusations against Socrates, as we would see, of course, making the weaker argument into the stronger, corrupting the youth of Athens, and defaming the traditional gods. In fact, Socrates would actually directly address this later in Plato's Apology, when he refers to a certain Greek playwright who who made use of some of these ideas about him. He does not name Aristophanes by name, but historians believe that he was obviously referring to Aristophanes. The second source is Xenophon, who was a historian, soldier, mercenary. He was also one of Socrates' students, and he was a good friend of him. Now, Xenophon presents a very personal and believed to be biased view of Socrates. And what stands out immediately after Aristophanes' portrayal is that Xenophon goes completely the other way with this. He directly addresses such accusations and misinterpretations of Socrates' character in his works. He claims that Socrates taught youth not to argue, but to be gentlemen, to be pious, good, faithful citizens. He also taught them to be faithful to the gods as he himself was. He went to the temples and he sacrificed weekly, and he was a very, very faithful worshiper of the traditional gods. And he also makes it clear that Socrates never took payment for his wisdom, as many later accused him of and tried to lump him in with the sophists for. And another interesting thing is that he presents Socrates as a very open and public person who's very approachable, will go out into the public and really go out of his way to talk to people. And he's very, very personal, according to Xenophon. Now, Xenophon wrote several things. 4 of his works feature Socrates primarily. The first, of course, is his Apology, which is Xenophon's response to Socrates' trial. Now, what's interesting about this is, of course, Xenophon was not present at the trial as he was busy fighting a war at the time, but he based his writing of his Apology on different eyewitness accounts of friends and fellow students who weren't present there. He also further addresses the trial and accusations in his Memorabilia, which is a long work detailing the personal life, personal habits, teachings, and just general wisdom of Socrates. And his other 2 works are Symposium, which is basically Socrates' day off, portrays him just enjoying simple pleasures like food, drink, and friendship, and then the Economicus, which is Xenophon's only philosophical dialogue, though the only thing that Socrates really discusses there is more personal and societal matters, such as like what makes the perfect housewife, what makes the perfect home, and things like that. And then now we finally move on to, of course, the most well-known source of Socrates, his student Plato, who is a philosopher in his own right, and he was, of course, a student of Socrates. Now, we know him primarily because of his own fame, and also that he wrote dozens of Socratic dialogues, such as the Republic, his Apology, and several others of like. And in each of these writings, he features Socrates as the central figure in really the majority of his own writings. And he presents these in a very philosophical way, focusing on the philosophy, the wisdom, and the thoughtful nature of Socrates himself. There are a few issues regarding Plato that kind of attribute to the Socratic problem, such as the theory that Plato has actually just used Socrates as his own mouthpiece for his own ideas, and that Socrates, as portrayed in Plato's writings, was not the real Socrates, but rather just a caricature that Plato used for his own words so that he wouldn't take the fall for any controversial ideas that he had, as we did see befell Socrates himself, supposedly. There are also a few apparent contradictions in some of his works, such as in Protagoras and Gorgias. We get kind of this contrast of what is goodness in relation to pleasure. In, of course, Protagoras, they seem to end on goodness is equal to pleasure, while in the later Gorgias, they clarify that some pleasures are not good. Now, despite these apparent contradictions, it is important to note that Socrates himself never definitely affirmed any specific ideas. And so whether or not the Socrates we see in Plato's dialogues is in fact the true Socrates or simply a mouthpiece, we can be sure by simply analyzing the writings that Plato presents a very consistent style of Socrates, who continues to ask questions and never stops on one conclusion. And so, as we focus on Plato's philosophical side, he a few times does kind of touch on the more personal side of Socrates, and there are a few apparent contradictions with Xenophon's writing. Of course, Xenophon presented him as a very public and open person, while as in Plato, he's of course not near as public and much more closed off and private. As of course Socrates says in Plato's Apology, it is better for me to live the private life, of course. And however, in spite of that one apparent contradiction, Xenophon and Plato really agree on pretty much every other detail about Socrates, down to his personal habits, most of his teachings, as well as his appearance. They both are consistent in explaining that he was a little bit overweight and was balding and kind of had a bit of a flat and round face. And they, of course, both present him as very pious and thoughtful and wise. Now, each of these three sources are pieces of a puzzle that we can use to piece together who actually was Socrates. We know for a fact from Aristophanes that he was a very publicly known figure, of course publicly known enough to be presented satirically in a comedic play. Of course, that portrayal of him can also be very easily understood as a very dramatized caricature of Socrates, where Xenophon and Plato kind of clarify his personal character, both presenting him as very pious, very faithful, very religious, very wise and thoughtful, and of course never really never taking payment for his teachings, nor going out of his way to, as accused of him, corrupting the youth of Athens. There were, of course, students of his that would misuse his teachings and his Socratic style, asking questions to the point where it would get them in trouble, and then they would just pass off the blame to their teacher Socrates. But Socrates himself never did anything of the kind. As for further Socratic writings, while there are many later historians and philosophers, again, that wrote about him, such as Aristotle, a student of Plato, these are the only three sources that we have who were able to write about him and know him in his own time. Many historians theorize that there were further writings that may have been lost in such events as the burning of the Library of Alexandria and were lost forever. We can never know for sure what happened to all of those. All we know is that Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Plato are the only remaining sources we have right now. And of course, Aristotle does make note of other Socratic dialogues that were in existence at his time, but those writings have since been lost or never kept further track of. So, here's my bibliography. Are there any questions? Yes, brother.
What motivated you to pursue this research?
Well, I actually did this project for my ancient history class with Dr. Owen, in which we were focusing on ancient Greece. He advised me to look for a topic for my term paper that really interested me personally. He asked me, what is something I really want to know about, and why do I want to know about it? Of course, in addition to my history minor, I also have a philosophy minor, and I have always been a huge Socrates fanboy. And I had, of course, heard just a few minor things, like that there are those who don't believe Socrates existed at all, and there are others who disagree about who Socrates necessarily was. And as the father of philosophy, I wanted to know who this guy really was. And this is as close as I could get.
Cool.
Yes, sir.
You seem to be eager to defend him against the charge that he corrupted the youth of Athens. I want to argue that the Socratic method is corrosive. That of course it corrupted the youth. it challenged everything. It's almost French deconstruction. You know, you read Plato's treatments and you discover you don't know what good is. You don't know what justice is. Do you really think you can make an argument that he didn't corrupt the youth?
I do not mean to be quite so defensive of that, though I would say I am defensive of that, because though he did give them the tool of the Socratic method, he did not tell them how to use it. As a student of philosophy myself, I have been able to use the Socratic method of questioning and asking why, primarily for my own growth, though many students of his would use this style simply to heckle people or even to gain power, such as Alcibiades, who was also believed to be a student of Socrates. So in terms, I would say there is potential for the Socratic method itself to be corrosive. However, it comes down to how you use it. He put the tool in their hand, taught and showed them how to use it, and they used it in a much different way.
I hear what you're saying. I guess I'm not fully convinced yet. And if you're using the method yourself, don't you find yourself driven to ask fundamental questions about really quite important stuff that everybody else accepts?
I do.
Does that on occasion not put you at odds with your society?
It has in some regards.
So you've been corrupted.
I guess so.
I offer that as a friendly comment.
Thank you. Any other questions?